Hello and welcome. I'm Leah Odenek, AIPAC's Associate Director for Policy and Government Affairs. Last week, violence broke out in Gaza yet again between Israel and the Iranian-backed terror group Palestinian Islamic Jihad. While Israel succeeded in taking out several key leaders of this terrorist organization, the group retaliated by launching more than 1,000 rockets into Israeli territory, the overwhelming majority of which, thankfully, were intercepted by the Iron Dome. Here to discuss the fallout from this latest round of conflict and what it means for the region is one of Washington's foremost Middle East experts, David Makovsky. David, welcome, and thanks so much for being with us.
Delighted to be with you, Leah.
So, David, let's start with the sequence of events. It seemed like Thursday was a very quiet day. I know that the roads were closed in the region in Israel around Gaza, but then things seemed to flare up. Tell us about it.
So really, you have to rewind the clock a few days earlier to Monday. Israel arrested Bassem Saidi, who was a leading figure of Islamic Jihad. Sometimes we call it PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the acronym. And he was, like I said, a key figure both in Jenin and in all of the West Bank for PIJ. Once he was arrested, Islamic Jihad in Gaza declared revenge. We saw reports saying they're going to mow down, quote unquote, anyone close to the border, civilians and the like. That's when Israel called for basically a semi-lockdown of its own citizens in the south and really created a situation where the roads were closed and the like, and there was a lot of pushback. Israel was desperately trying to defuse the situation by immediately enlisting Egypt and to some degree Qatar and the United Nations to cool things off and make sure the Islamic Jihad did not retaliate against Israeli citizens, and then the whole incident would be gone. They actually put on Twitter the fact that this guy was, is in good health in Israeli detention. He was not killed the way some of these reports put out. But those efforts did not succeed, and Islamic Jihad said, we're going forward. So by Friday, and I think the fact that the people in the South were saying, hey, we're like in lockdown, this is a victory for the Islamic Jihad, probably, was an exacerbating factor. And that's when Israel took a preemptive strike against the northern commander of Gaza, of the Islamic Jihad, a fellow by the...
But it seems like Israel had information that they were planning on, it was preemptive because they had information that they were going to do.
Right.
Stuff.
Like I said, since Monday, when Islamic Jihad said we're going to go after civilians along the border, Israel was fearful of commanders who was when they were anti-tank people and the like, that they were about to strike. And so I think Israel was trying to use diplomatic means from Monday to Friday to avert this situation. But when they did not back off the Islamic Jihad, Israel went and struck first and killed this northern commander, a fellow by the name of Taysar Jabari. And so that's what kind of launched it. But unlike some of the previous rounds in Gaza, you had the prime minister go on the air immediately saying the target is the Islamic Jihad. The key point here, why it was such a successful mission, in my view, was that it was so focused on the Islamic Jihad and that Hamas stayed out of the fighting. And that enabled Israel to conduct a very different sort of operation, which it had in previous rounds.
So let's get into Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Right.
And Hamas. Tell me about the difference between Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. How are they different? How are they similar?
The most important thing to know, I think, is that Islamic Jihad is almost all of its funding, not 100%, but a large majority of its funding comes from Iran. It's really a terror proxy, as you said in your opening remarks, and it takes its orders from Tehran. Its leaders are in Lebanon, Damascus, and they are kind of owned and operated, I would say, by Iran. Hamas is more of a broad-based movement. It's a terrorist organization, but it's got a social base within Gaza. It's a mass organization, and it does not want Iran calling the shots. So it's got a very
But it'll also take funding from Iran,
They'll
right?
take funding from anybody. They'll take funding from Iran, but they will not be like a small group that's just about terrorism. They've got a broader set of calculations.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? How do they relate to each other?
I think Hamas sees them as a thorn in their side in many ways, that Hamas sees itself, hey, we're sovereign in Gaza, and again, one of the difference of Hamas is that they have a whole history of being part of the Gaza chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood that go back, way back for decades. You could argue that the Islamic Jihad was an offshoot of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, but Hamas sees itself as, we're sovereign in Gaza. Who is this rogue organization that decides, we're going to have our own missiles, we're going to have our own structure? That's not something they like. And so there's a certain rivalry there, and I think sometimes Islamic Jihad wants to embarrass Hamas, to say, you guys have so many calculations to make, we don't. We're just going to kill Jews wherever we could find them, and we get our funding elsewhere, and we don't take our orders from you. So there's a certain rivalry, and we've seen this back in 2019. It's happened before, where Hamas has stayed out. But let's be clear about one thing that does unite them. They both don't accept Israel the size of a telephone booth on a Tel Aviv beach. They're both proudly rejectionist.
Let's focus a little bit on Hamas. As you mentioned, they did stay out of it this time, and I don't think that was a given. Right. What was in it for them? Why did they stay out?
Well, this is a huge question, and we're trying to make sure we understand. And sometimes these things, as you know, who's followed this closely, Leah, is that these things are not mutually exclusive. Okay, so there's sometimes a deterrent element that Hamas does much more cost-benefit analysis, and they'll say is, Israel's got overwhelming force, and we are still trying to lick our wounds from May 2021, the last time we fought Israel, and we're not helping anything in the battle of jihad unless we're ready, and they're not ready yet after a year after that round. And so there is a deterrence element, but there's also an element for them of, if we're sovereign, we don't want to be part of a losing thing. We don't trust the Islamic Jihad, that they've thought through how this thing ends. And they become a little more sensitive to the public. And I think the public is sick of all these rounds. We're hearing this anecdotally. We don't have yet data coming out of Gaza, so we have to be cautious. But they need the revenue of workers in Israel now more.
I mean, Israel has opened up
right, because
quite a bit.
Israel has opened up by having 14,000 or so Gaza workers, and Naftali Bennett, the previous prime minister, and Lapid, the current caretaker prime minister, have both made clear they would like to expand this. They want to give Hamas something to lose. Once there's fighting, people can't work. If they can't work, there's no revenue. Now, we're hearing reports that of the 14,000, maybe 10,000 of the 14,000 were actually in Israel at the time and didn't get back. But 4,000 were certainly stranded in Gaza, and certainly Israel's not going to expand this if people are trying to kill them. So the fact that Hamas is taking public sentiment into account is, you could argue, a good sign. I just want us to be a little cautious in over-extrapolating from that, because there was a ceasefire with Hamas between 2019 and 2021, and then it blew up when Hamas
So they're just preparing for the next round, and they weren't quite ready?
Right, they weren't ready, and people thought if you can do a deal that Hamas responds to economic incentives, then maybe there's a certain evolution, there's a maturation. But what we saw with May 2021 was Hamas could not resist itself, that once it could define itself as we're the guardians of Jerusalem, all those economic calculations went out the window. and they fought Israel anyway. So, it's encouraging to think that they are making cost-benefit calculations, that maybe economically having workers in Israel helps their economy. But I just remember May 2021, it's branded into me that they don't only make economic calculations, and when they feel it's good for them to strike, at the end of the day, they're still a terrorist organization.
And they'll strike. But at least this time they didn't.
No, they did not. And credit the Egyptians and the Qataris here, who I think really played key roles in being the go-betweens.
Let's talk a little bit about Iron Dome. Once again, it was really crucial in protecting and defending innocent lives. This year, Congress passed supplemental funding for Iron Dome, which our members were very involved in lobbying for and making happen. We know it's very important. Can you talk about what Iron Dome did, how it did it, and how it performed in terms of this conflict as opposed to previous ones?
Iron Dome is a lifesaver. It's one of these rare game changers that you see in warfare. It's incredible. And we looked up the data, and it's really, even during its existence, the numbers have been, in 2012, 86% of all rockets were intercepted by Iron Dome, and now the number is 97%. That means in the decade since Iron Dome was rolled out, there's been a 10% growth of effectiveness. So that means there's iterations, and it's evolving, and it's getting better and better. So that's very important. It's saving Israeli civilian lives, and frankly, it's saving Palestinian lives, because when Israel is not faced with civilian catastrophe, its retaliations are going to be different as well. So it's one of these rare things that I think is saving civilians on both sides of the divide. It is true, though, it takes more to defend against an incoming rocket than it does to fire the rocket. And that's why Israel's off on its new laser project, where that cost-benefit analysis will change, where it'll be much cheaper to defend. But until that happens, there are a lot of civilians alive today, thanks to Iron Dome. And the Iron Dome system also knows when some of the rockets are going into the Mediterranean, it doesn't have to intercept.
It's a smart system.
It's a smart system. And by the way, in this case, from what we see, numbers I've seen, 17 to 20% of the Islamic Jihad rockets never made it out of Gaza. And they sometimes broke up. We saw this in Jabalia, there's been misfires where some civilians were killed. But it's really, Iron Dome has saved lives.
Yeah, I think I read that there were more civilian casualties from the misfires from Palestinian Islamic Jihad itself inside Gaza.
And it's one of the changes of this round from previous rounds, is that Israel had the video out of the misfires where they saw the trajectories of the rockets, just like the Jabalia one, which killed civilians. And because the initial reporting was it was done by Israel, and it turns out that wasn't true. It was the misfire from Jabalia itself. Israel was just much quicker on the mark this time. If you look at what made this a success, it seems to me that Israel took the initiative when it had to. It had a very focused goal, which was the Islamic Jihad, and was able to keep Hamas out of the fight. And third was a messaging system where the public saw things like the misfire, and it saw this incredible satellite feed of Israeli Air Force and planners talking to each other, saying, hey, don't hit so-and-so because there's a child not far and it might get killed.
Well, I want to actually pick up on that point, but before I do, on the misfires, I understand that since the ceasefire, actually, that Hamas actually put out new guidance for press that they're not allowed to report on those sorts of things. In the battle of the narrative, did Israel win this one?
I think it did, because it was really short. And what it meant was, first of all, there's not a lot of sympathy for the Islamic Jihad. Let's start there. People understand this is an Iranian proxy. And because the civilian situation was much more under control, and it was so focused in time and place. And also what you had was a new factor with the Arabs, Morocco, the UAE, and Jordan, basically, and Egypt, not condemning Israel during the fighting. Yes, Bahrain did, the one Abraham Accord country that did. Saudi Arabia did, but many of them did not. And the US and Britain also said Israel's the right to defend itself. And so when you have a very short operation and you have that broad international support, it makes a difference. Well, but what is Israel seen in the longer operations is sometimes you start this way with that support, but all it takes is one errant missile, and accidentally kills civilians, and then the whole international mood it turns upside down. So I just think everything clicked, and I should say on the Israeli side there was not one fatality. There were some injuries. I think people tripped maybe on the way to and there were some other cases on the way to the sealed room and things like that. But it was remarkable. There were some, tragically, also Palestinian fatalities, but I think a lot of that is attributable to the misfire.
Well, you talked about the extreme efforts that we saw that Israel makes.
Well, the one more that I think was fascinating is this thing called, I've learned a new term this weekend, called the glide bombs, where Israel worked with a group of engineers on the Khalid Mansour, who was the southern commander, was killed. Apparently the trip was aborted 3 times. The mission was aborted because of the fear that civilians were in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask you about, that we saw Israel released the footage that they actually stopped their operation because they saw civilians. And we've seen these extreme efforts that Israel makes.
The glide bomb was, my understanding was, that they had engineers saying if you hit the 7th floor of this building, it will mean that if this guy is on the 6th floor, no one else will be killed. And they somehow knew that it would not hurt civilians otherwhere in a multi-story building. And here was the Islamic Jihad finding out that not only does Israel know where these people live, that joke, I know where you live, they knew even the secret hiding places of where these people lived, and they were able to reach them without killing the civilians around them. It was extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. But I want to ask what this says about how Israel is carrying out these operations, in terms of thinking about civilian casualties. And I mean, you talked about how careful they are. I know that Israel puts a lot of focus on this. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Look, I think what's happened is Israel's been doing this for years. It's just what's different this time is Israel's getting the message out in almost real time of how they're doing it. I don't think people have heard it. I didn't hear the word glide bomb. I never heard that phrase. That they have engineers working on, if you hit this window, can you make sure no one else is hurt? So now you're seeing that. Or you're seeing that Israel aborted the mission 3 times because they were afraid of a child, and you see the satellite feed. You used to hear maybe IDF spokespeople talk about it, but you didn't
now you can
see it, hear it. It makes a difference. So it was this rare moment where the sun, the moon, and the stars all converged in a way that worked to Israel's advantage. I never want to overstate things and say, well, does that mean it's the end of the Islamic Jihad? No. But will Islamic Jihad think twice about doing this again? Does it have a deterrence value? Possibly, yes.
So the international community did see these things, and I want to talk about their response. You talked a little bit about the Abraham Accords countries, but other countries as well had different reactions, and certainly the U.S. Came out with a very strong response, the administration did, about Israel's right to defend itself. Can you compare that to previous conflicts?
Look, I think in the last round, too, President Biden, resisted pressure in May. That was almost a war of social media, and you know this very well, how inflammatory when things go viral, they take on a life of its own. The thing went on for 11 days, and Biden I thought, really stood firm in saying, we're going to do this, we're not going to grandstand, we're not going to the UN, we're not going to condemn Israel. I remember I was in the U.S. government when it went on 51 days.
I remember that.
So that was a very different dynamic. I think what's happened is that the Israeli decision-making apparatus, both at the political level and at the security level, has learned that these long operations are just too fraught, that even if you get people on your side in the beginning, they're not with you at the end. And that's been a lesson that Israel has learned, that you want to keep everyone on side, you got to make these short and keep to your focus. And then your narrative is more likely to prevail.
But there was even European response on this one was more positive than in the past. The UN, though, had a Security Council meeting.
Yeah, but I'll say it this way.
Which wasn't so positive, we'll say.
But the Security Council meeting was after the fighting was over, and it was a closed meeting. It wasn't a vote to condemn Israel. It was a case where the United Arab Emirates seems to be straddling a line. There's always, as you know, in the Security Council, one Arab country that kind of represents all the Arabs. I mean, if there's ever an Arab state in the Security Council that Israel feels a certain simpatico with, it's the UAE. Mm-hmm. But they have a dual role, and what we've seen with them in the Security Council is they try to maintain that as well. So I think the way they threaded the needle was by saying we have to convene a Security Council meeting, but we'll do it after the ceasefire, and there won't be a vote, and it's closed. So I think as these things go, it was probably the best Israel could hope for.
So let's talk about the ceasefire. How did Israel get to that point, and how is it holding up?
Look, I think Egypt is the key broker. That people need to understand. It's always where geography is so important, because they run the Rafah crossing point in southern Gaza. So I know people don't wake up in the morning thinking about the Rafah crossing point in southern Gaza, but that's crucial, because if you run the Rafah crossing point, you decide if people from Gaza could go into Egypt or they can't go in. So that gives you a point of leverage in dealing with Gaza, and in this case, the Islamic Jihad. And Israel's point is, we're not giving no concessions to terror, you're basically, you just got to stop fighting. Quiet will be met with quiet. There have been some reports that Israel has offered some visitation of prisoners. I don't think this is the concession they would have wanted. They would want something much more. But it seems to me that Egypt, as every time we've seen rounds, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now to 2022, it's always, there's a thread that Egypt is the key. If putting things in, as you know, Leah, I love sports. So right. In baseball, there's something called the closer. The person who comes in the ninth inning and gets it done. It's always the Egyptians, and here too.
So they got it done, but I understand Palestinian Islamic Jihad is threatening that if they don't get their prisoners released, if they don't get whatever, they'll start up again.
Everyone has got domestic politics they have to show. They have to prove they got something. But I think Israel was, I think this was almost a casebook study of how to do it. But the key is to keep Hamas out of the fighting, because it would have been a totally different, with all the good intentions of wanting to keep these things focused and short and the like, if Hamas would have gotten into the fight, rockets would have come from all different directions. And I don't know if the IDF could have did as well as it did in limiting the scope of the fighting. So part of this was a diplomatic achievement, I think, of Egypt in conveying to Hamas, to stay out.
To stay out, yeah. That was so important. You talked about the Abraham Accords countries and about their different approach and different reaction and response to what happened, especially in the public sphere. Any tea leaves to read from these statements that indicate further shifting attitudes from any other countries? Are there dogs that didn't bark in this?
I think Bahrain was somewhat of a disappointment. They condemned Israel immediately. And I think Israel, that has signed security agreements against the defense ministry, been there and the like, I was a bit disappointed. I thought Bahrain would more.
Why do you think they did that?
I think it has something to do with they've got splits in that country. It's a Sunni minority government, essentially, dealing with a Shia majority. And I think that there's more domestic friction there. So, I mean, I don't know. There might be other things we don't know. And sometimes in some of these Arab states, sadly, they like having it all ways, to say publicly we condemn and then privately we talk to you. So the split screen reality wouldn't be the first time in the Middle East. I think the UAE, Morocco really did it well, calling for restraint, but not condemning Israel. So I think those were really good. I think Saudis, I was looking for the nuance that would show that this, here you've got a beginning of a dialogue. Saudis allowing Israeli airplanes now to fly over the airspace. I was wondering, would we see this publicly? But it seems like the public statements are, those are not one of the first things to say. Look, to be fair, if you're an Arab and you're watching Al Jazeera, right? And even if you're watching Al Arabiya, I mean, you're seeing violence in Gaza. The easiest thing for these Arab states to do is first condemn.
Even if it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Iranian proxy?
Right, I know. Well, that's where the hope was, that they wouldn't do it. But, I would have liked the Saudis to be a little more nuanced. I would have liked Bahrain to do it differently. Morocco comes through, I think, with flying colors. I think the UAE did as well as expected. And Jordan, which is frankly where you've got a large Palestinian population and is actually among all the Arab states, has kind of, had some friction with Israel over the Palestinian issue. They did not condemn. They called for restraint. They called for things to stop now. Ayman Safadi, I know the foreign minister, I know him well, for the foreign minister of Jordan. So they try to have it a little bit both ways, but I think they came out of this well.
I think in contrast to last year's conflict,
right.
We didn't see much inside Israel. And certainly
Yes,
there was a lot in
that's a very good
Jerusalem.
point.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I think there's a reason for it, frankly. You've got three things that are different this time. What's known as the mixed cities, whether it's Lud, whether it's Akko, whether it's, Ramla or places like that, Jaffa, What you had in 2021 is that it was about Al-Aqsa. It was about the Haram al-Sharif, a holy Muslim shrine. And what we've seen is often it's religion that animates people to the streets.
I mean, but this happened during Tisha B'Av.
I know.
Where
That was, I think, part of the skill, actually, and maybe part of the good back channeling that we'll only know about. But, you had, I think, 2,200 people that went up to the Temple Mount on Tisha B'Av, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, Jews, and Ben-Gvir is at the extreme end. But the police did a corridor in a way to keep people apart from many protesters. The fact that Hamas was not in the fight, I think, might have been certain signals were sent. I'm sure the Israelis told the Egyptians, hey, there's this thing called Tisha B'Av, a religious event. 2,200 people are not going up because of Pidge in Gaza, and don't see this in any sort of provocative light. It's a purely religious thing. And guess what? There were no serious incidents. The Israeli police, the Jerusalem police handled it beautifully. And it wasn't. If I worried if it would have been like May, where that blew up, you would have seen the cities, because people often respond in an emotive way to something that's religious. And so you've got, I think that's the main piece. What changed was that there was no real Al-Aqsa as a magnet, as a lightning rod for tension. A. B. Israel really identified some of the troublemakers, frankly, from the last round. And third is that Israel is starting to create policing in some of the Arab areas, and that has been Mansour Abbas's one of his main calls has been. It's so funny because in our country, the issue of more policing is controversial. But among the Israeli Arab population,
they want more.
They want more Israel, not less Israel. They want more policing because they feel Israel doesn't care about their areas, and that this creates a certain chaos, anarchy, and Israel has responded by now having much more units in some of these areas. So it's important to say that that has been a response to Israeli Arabs themselves who have wanted more policing.
From this conversation, it's clear you think this was a big success in terms of Israel's operations. But I wonder what impact you think that this conflict will have in terms of the future of Gaza-Israel relations. We talked a little bit about Hamas. We talked about their calculations, that they can turn on a dime. You talked about every year, you counted on your fingers, this year, this year, this year. What are the tea leaves for the future?
Look, it's hard. We always have to be humble. Okay, so look, 2019 to 2021 was the hope that they were making more economic rather than terror calculations, because Israel was making economic concessions, and they were restrained for those 2 years. Now the question is, it's much more focused on workers. It's on, can they go from 14,000, much higher, that every job in Israel feeds, we think, 7 people in Gaza. So if Hamas actually cared about its people, then it would be clear that Israel would want to increase the number. I mean, people forget in the 90s, I think the numbers were close to 200,000. But the numbers haven't been anywhere near that. And just taking it to 14,000 is like going almost from zero. I mean, so I think the more Hamas shows that economic calculations are important, you'll see more workers. With more workers, you'll see more revenue, and you'll see a kind of almost a virtuous circle, if you will. My problem is I don't trust Hamas, and I still think they're a rejectionist terror group, and ultimately they care more about violence against Israel than they care about the economic well-being of their own people. If they cared about the economic well-being of their own people, they could easily signal, keep increasing the numbers, and we're going to keep staying out. But they haven't been doing that. So that's why I wonder, as part of it, that they haven't consolidated their losses, they haven't rearmed. You know what I mean? I'm not sure. I would like to think that they are evolving, that they're become more mature the more they are now that they are responsible for Gaza itself. It's just, my problem with this is that I've been around the block.
Yeah, too much experience.
Right.
you know better.
Right, and therefore I want to be very cautious not to give them too much credit for this round. It was a great tactical success of Israel. I hope it makes Islamic Jihad realize that the balance of forces, so to speak, are really stacked against them, and don't do this again. But I wouldn't bet the farm on that either. So these are things to think about.
In the Israeli context, there's going to be an election in November. Politically, how did this conflict, how is it playing politically?
Look, we've seen the numbers, and I've been looking at like 4 or 5 different polling numbers. And Lapid, as prime minister, gets a bump up for the way he handled the crisis. He's closed the gap to 11 points down. He was at 20 points, I believe, with Bibi over, is he suitable to be prime minister? I think no less significantly, he's worked in harmony with a rival of his, which has been Benny Gantz, the defense minister. They signed every press release together. There's even video of them like putting their arm around each other during this crisis. So, I mean, I can't imagine a government functioning better than this one did. But will that translate politically? I'm not so sure, because again, I've been around the block so many times, is that what I've seen is whenever there's terrorism, it moves Israel to the right. And therefore, it's unclear to me that despite Lapid and Gantz getting very high marks, it's unclear to me that that's going to be a political bonanza for them. But I think to the extent they showed that they could work harmoniously. And also during Ramadan, you know, when there was that violence, I think they worked well together as well with Bennett. And but it's unclear if that really works. What we saw in Ramadan was that that's where some of the parliamentary support actually frayed and led to the collapse of the government. So we just have to be cautious in extrapolating public approval that they clearly like the way that the crisis was handled and how it plays out politically.
So we're running short on time, but before I let you go, all of us are such huge fans of your analysis and the work that you do. Do you have any new projects in the pipeline that we should be looking out for?
Well, thank you. We're going to start shortly a 4th season of the podcast, Decision Points. And we're going to be interviewing authors, people who recently have written books about the U.S.-Israel relationship and about Israel. And I really hope for the many tens of thousands of people that have downloaded the podcast, I really hope they tune in, and I hope, you know, they've read the book that Dennis and I did about, you know, leadership and, you know, 4 historic examples of leaders making historic decisions. So that's a couple things. I'm going to be, you know, on Twitter at David Makovsky. You can always find like the latest, and I welcome people's feedback. Well,
I've certainly read your book. It was outstanding. I recommend it to all. Really, thank you. Thank you for enlightening us on this on last weekend, and for all the work that you do. It's really wonderful, and we really appreciate your insight.
Thank you very much for your kind words.
And thank all of you for joining us on the AIPAC app.